Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies and friends. It is my privilege to speak before you this morning. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your continuing leadership. We already know that the amount of investment that is needed goes into the trillions. What we don't always recognize is that the locus of action is already shifting to the emerging markets and the developing countries. Nearly 90% of additional electricity demand over the next 2 decades will come from those regions. My own country's policies this decade, between 2020 and 2030, will result in a 4 billion tons reduction in emissions against a no policy scenario. Several subnational governments are already developing their net zero pathways in India. Some of the largest non-banking financial institutions are working on plans to become net zero investors. There are new regulations, taxonomies, instruments, and institutions that are being developed. And yet, there is the bad and the inconvenient. Despite all this effort, we know that across the world, emerging markets and developing economies, excluding China, still account for just about 15% of global clean energy spending. So there is a mismatch between where the action is and where the money flows. Or as I like to put it, money does not flow yet to where the sun shines the most. So the question for us is, how do we move from ambition to action to acceleration? And the report that Catherine McKenna has just tabled showcases some of the ways forward. And I'll just elaborate on that and a few other ideas. Number one, as Malango just referred to, we still need to get this deal on a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. But this is not just about the quantum of money, but the quality of climate finance. Climate finance must be concessional, consistent, catalytic, and credible. And credibility comes from money that is delivered rather than what is promised. Number two, we must move towards replenishment of funds that multilateral development banks need to unlock the global climate finance. Despite the discussions in the G20 and elsewhere, we still know that the amount of increase in the balance sheets of the MDBs is still far short of what is needed. And this is not just for climate finance, this has to also deal with the debt crisis and the fiscal crisis that developing countries are facing. Because if on one hand we want development and decarbonization, we cannot forget the two other elephants in the room, disaster and debt. And therefore, third, we need to also then leverage these increased public finance to crowd in many multiples of private capital. This will not happen unless, number four, we make sure that the NDCs that are upgraded ensure that the scale of investment is in line with the kinds of domestic policies we develop. We need to mitigate counterparty risk. We need to create demand certainty for corporates and project developers. We need to build the supporting infrastructure, such as the grid. We've got to make doing business in developing countries easy in terms of deployment of this capacity. Number five, we'll need to make sure that the money actually flows closer to where the action is, whether it is the subnational governments, the states, or the cities. Cities are still not getting access to the funding to enact the just transition. So the next round of NDCs can make specific reference to these kinds of unique roles that the subnational levels play. And finally, we need to make sure that financial standard setters ask themselves the question whether prudential frameworks are becoming a barrier or an enabler for the finance we need. So obviously this agenda that I've laid out is not just about corporates or just about subnational governments. Mr. Secretary General, global collective action needs global collective coordination. Each actor, whether it's a national government, a subnational government, a corporate, or a multilateral development bank, has a role to play. Must recognize that we are running a marathon and a relay race. None of us can afford to drop the baton. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ghosh.